So the first demonstration is going to be probably the most basic, simple presentation I'm going to give, which is just a manual animation of the exploded view, where the basic concepts on how to think about exploding this over time without creating too much work for yourself from an animation standpoint. The animation should be relatively simple and systematic, but getting the nuances, the timing, the pacing, and the presentation of the animation is where you're going to spend a great deal of time. Now, my concept here is that I want to start to just kind of pull all the different pieces of the central body apart over time. Eventually, I'll show you a more realized kind of strategy for this and pull off the boosters and have things explode at different points in time. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to focus on that main rocket body. Now, even though you might be working on completely different content, these concepts are still going to apply to the same project that you're working on. So no matter whether we're exploding a toy, a wristwatch, an Xbox, you name it, the idea is that you take these components and kind of reveal them over time. My basic strategy is, again, I'm going to focus just on this rocket body element. Now, inside my rocket body, I have about 8 elements that I want to animate over time. Now, just to get the ball rolling, I'm going to modify my overall frame length from 90 frames to 180 frames. Now, that's going to be even still, my entire animation is going to take a lot more than 180 frames, but I think 6 seconds to pull this rocket, the central body rocket, apart is going to make sense, and I can always shorten it or expand it once I get the basic animation down. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want my rocket to start in the fully assembled position. So I have the different components that I plan to animate. I have those selected, and I'm going to mark the keyframe at the beginning of time. Now, I could choose to mark this keyframe a little bit later in time, which would be probably the best choice, because then that gives a little bit of pause in the front end before the rocket starts to explode. Okay? In fact, if I undo that, I'll advance the playhead and just start at frame 30, and now mark that keyframe. What I've done is I've recorded the scale, the position, and the rotation for all of those objects that are selected. Okay? I'm going to scrub through time. I'm going to advance the playhead to frame 150, so that's leaving 30 frames at the end of time. Okay, again, I'm kind of looking for 1 second of pause maybe at the end, and maybe I find it's too long or too short, but I want a little bit of pause so that it's not continuous motion, so it's not exploding and reassembling if I decide to loop this thing. So I've advanced my playhead to frame 150, and I'm going to mark the playhead. Now, you might be scratching your head saying, well, wait a second, you didn't animate anything. Well, that's right. What I've done is I've preserved the start and the reassembled position of all of those components that I have selected. And just in really simple terms, if I split this animation right down the middle, and I'm just going to create really, really simple animation, I have frame 90 selected, and I'm going to be pretty imprecise about this. A little bit later I'll be more precise, but I'm going to move the cap up, and I'm going to mark that keyframe. I'm going to select the next component, and I'll pull that up. I'll mark that keyframe, and I'm just going to move down through the components, marking the keyframes as I go. Move it up, mark the keyframe. This core body, even though it's made of a couple of different components for the sake of this demo, I'll just pull that out just a little bit, and I'll mark that keyframe. I'm left here with that bottom component, and I'll just move that up just a little bit. Now, this isn't as dramatic of motion as I may have ultimately need, but this quick animation will show this rocket coming apart over time. If I rewind the playhead and I hit play, it stays still for about 1 second. It expands, explodes, and then immediately starts to reassemble itself. Okay, so I got a little problem with the animation in that when I explode this view, I really want to keep this animation exploded for a while. Okay, I want to pull it apart, and I want to have it in its exploded state for maybe a couple of seconds. Maybe I want the camera to rotate around the object, or maybe I want the entire object to tilt in space so I get a better view of it. there's a lot of things that I want to do. I don't want to explode it and have it immediately reassemble, at least not in my final presentation. So there's a couple of different options that I could do to kind of get this to stay in its blown apart state. And I think the easiest thing to do will be to select all of the components that I had selected in the first place. And now I should be able to hold down is it the control key? Nope. Is it the option key? Maybe it's the command key. I'm trying to copy that playhead, and in the timeline, there it is. Let me undo that. With that 90 keyframe selected, I'll hold down the control key. I gotta select it first. Now I'm holding down the control key, and I'm clicking and dragging, and I'm making a duplicate keyframe, and I'll drop that at about 120. Okay, that'll give me 1 second of pause, or 1 second of explosion. I think I inadvertently goofed it up. Let me backtrack here. Hit the playhead. We'll give that a quick render. Yeah, so it looks like I goofed up the original position of all the content on frame 90. Okay, so I actually need to go back through and get rid of that keyframe. I should be able to just select that keyframe, hit the delete key, and that should get rid of any animation that I originally created. And in fact, I did. That looks pretty good. So everything's back to normal. So I'm going to scrub the playhead back to 90, and I'm going to go through that entire process that I just went through, which is I'll move the cap up, record. So I just goofed up, so I got to go back and reanimate everything. I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. In fact, you got the drill here, so I'm going to pause really quickly. Okay, I paused it just for a few seconds, just so I could see through the rest of that animation, and I have exactly set up what I had before. I'll hit the play button, my object explodes and quickly goes back to its assembled version. And so what I'm going to do is, rather than try to play around with this timeline down here, I think that this is a little imprecise. I prefer to work in the timeline window. That gives me a better sense of all the different animated elements. I have a summary, so I can select every keyframe that's on frame 90, and there's a number of things that I can do. So I have frame 90 selected in the summary. So I'm looking at the summary animation, and I'm just clicking on frame 90. That's where my animation is exploded. That's the keyframe that I've inserted for each element that's been pulled apart in space. And if I want to preserve that explosion for, say, 1 second in time, I want these keyframes to also exist on frame 20. And I can do that by selecting the summary, control clicking and dragging out until frame 20, and releasing my mouse. Now when I scrub the playhead, after frame 30, I start to get the explosion to frame 90. And from 90 to frame 120, we more or less maintain that explosion. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of motion there between frame 90 and 20, which may have you scratching your head because you say, well, wait a second, I just copied those same keyframes over to frame 20, so technically there's no change. But if you go way back in time to when we were focusing on the bouncing ball, if you remember the F curves that we looked at, and I'll just kind of look at the position of one of these keyframes, everything has a curved spline interpolation, which means that there's a curve built into this. And if I were to zoom way in on this, and I'll just kind of see if I can vertically expand. Let's try that again. Vertically expand. There we go. That's what I was looking for. If I look at the Y value of any one of these, the position of the Y value of any one of these elements, you'll see the keyframe is set to a coordinate on Y, but then because the F curve causes that motion spline to actually bend upwards above the position of our keyframe, we get a little bit of a bend, or we get a little bit of a bounce between the two keyframes. And this is pretty typical when you're animating with spline interpolation, which is the default in Cinema 4D. You have two choices. One, you could ignore any kind of little bounce that you get for this animation. Okay, but if the designer in me wants to make that absolutely still. Okay, so the easiest thing to do in this case, and I'll just kind of reveal that Y value again, is I can select that keyframe, or more importantly, I know that this is happening on every one of these elements, so I'll select the entire summary. That means that every keyframe on frame 90 for every object has been selected. What I can do is I can look in the Attributes Manager and I can choose to clamp that value. When I clamp that value, it's doing it for all the keyframes. What it's saying is that on this keyframe, don't allow it to exceed whatever the Y value, the original Y value of that keyframe is. So if we set it to say, 1100, that spline interpolation allows it to creep over 1100 on the Y value just by the way that the splines are being interpolated. Okay, but we've told to clamp on frame 90, and if I select the summary on frame 120, go to the Attributes Manager and set it to clamp. What I've done is I've effectively leveled off any F-curve creep that I've achieved. So now visually what's happening is if I rewind and hit play, I get my explosion, and I get a pause for exactly 1 second with absolutely no motion, and then my object reassembles. Okay, so I've exploded manually my object. Maybe my animation is a little too fast, maybe it's a little too slow. I can always go into the timeline. I'll just zoom out. I can always go into the timeline and tweak this timeline. I can scale the entire animation. I can move keyframes around if I want to by selecting on the summary. In the summary row, just select that keyframe, and now everything underneath it is selected. So maybe I want it to explode a little bit earlier, and maybe I want, let's see, so I'm starting at my animation is starting at frame 0. At 30 it starts to explode. At 60 there's a 1 second explosion. It stays exploded for a few seconds and closes over 1 second. So I pretty much have a symmetrical animation at this point. Looks pretty good. And now when I hit rewind and hit play and just kind of peek over here, I can see that my rocket explodes and then reassembles. Now, of course, there's a lot of different elements that I need to manage here, and once I start exploding more stuff, and tipping the rocket and having it roll in space, I'm going to have a pretty complicated timeline, so I want to keep track of that. In the next presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can build dependencies on one object to the next, so that when you move an object, it uniformly causes another object to move or control its position or scale or rotation. We'll do that in the next presentation.